Good evening. Thank you very much for coming, and it gives me great pleasure to give you a warm welcome for this evening's event, a warmer welcome than the weather outside in London would suggest. But certainly on our behalf, the British Academy loves to celebrate the really wonderful things that we have been able to sponsor and that we draw attention to. And this conversation with Professor Nandini Das is a chance to celebrate the extraordinarily interesting and wonderful book that has won the book prize this past year. I'm Charles Tripp, just introduce myself, Emeritus Professor of Middle East Politics at SOAS, and I'm the chair of the judging panel of the book prize, as well as the chair for this evening. And it's really a chance to celebrate the extraordinary book, as I said, of Professor Das, and also to celebrate Professor Das's presence here herself, because in the run-up to the announcement of the winner last year, Professor Das had a very important engagement in South Korea. So she floated in here on a large screen of that size, but was unable to be here in person. So it really is really wonderful that you could be here today with us. And I think that the way we're going to organize it is that we'll have a general discussion. I'll say some words first, and then we'll have a conversation with Nandini, and then open the floor to questions, as well as open online questions as well. But before we start, there are two things I have to say. One is about housekeeping, which is that apparently we are not anticipating any test fire alarms. So if the fire alarm goes off, it's a real fire. Do not panic. The staff will show you to the main staircase, and you process outside, and the assembly point is just on the top of the Duke of York steps to the left of the Academy outside itself. And I'm also to tell you that we welcome people tweeting during the event at the British Academy and using the hashtag British Academy Book Prize. The second thing, however, before we talk about the celebrate the book itself, is that this book prize is opening again for 2024. So we want to give people notice that from now on until the end of February, the field is open to the new submissions for the book prize for 2024. And the prize, just to remind people, is worth £25,000. And it's the British Academy's way of recognizing the enormous contributions of public understanding of world cultures by non-fiction authors from around the world. It was first awarded in 2013 and is the only non-fiction book prize dedicated specifically to promoting global cultural understanding. And if you know of any non-fiction book that is accessible, that contributes to our understanding of the world cultures, please consider submitting it for consideration to the 2024 book prize. Recent winners, I won't go through all the winners of the last 10 years, but certainly recent winners give a flavor of the variety and the riches of the prize itself. Is, for instance, 2021's winner, Waves Across the South, A New History of Revolution and Empire by Sujit Sivasundaram. A book traces the origins of our times from the perspectives of indigenous and non-European peoples in the Indian and Pacific Oceans. And in 2022, the prize was awarded to When Women Kill, Four Crimes Retold, an extraordinary book by Alia Trabuco Zaran, which explores attitudes to female homicides, not just in Chile, where it's set, but in more generally as well. And of course, this year, Nandini Das is the winner of the 2023 book prize. So just to remind people, we're accepting books until the 29th of February, so please, publishers, authors, and others, be aware that that's the deadline by which you must submit it, and that would be excellent. The other thing to say this evening, which is very gratifying, is that our judging panel is composed of 5 of us, bringing as much variety as we can to the kinds of disciplines and subjects we look at and expertise. And for the 2024 book prize panel, as well as myself as chair, and food historian Professor Rebecca Earle, who will be joining me for a second year on the panel. We can also welcome 3 new members. Ritula Shah, who is happily with us here this evening. Many of you will recognize Ritula's voice as the lead presenter of Radio 4's World Tonight for many years. And Ritula currently works to present a daily show on Radio Classic FM. There's also Bronwyn Maddox, who's joining the judging panel, an honorary fellow of the British Academy, but also and previously the director of the Institute of Government, and now currently director and chief executive of Chatham House, the international affairs think tank. There's also Professor Chakravarti Ramprasad, a fellow of the British Academy as well, a distinguished professor of religion and philosophy at Lancaster University, with a keen interest in comparative philosophy and religion. And I'm really looking forward to working with these new colleagues and, of course, to reading many of the books that we submitted over the next few months. But now to our main event, which is really the reason why we're all here this evening, is to celebrate Nandini Das's extraordinary book, Courting India, England, Mughal India, and the Origins of Empire. And to have a conversation about the book and how it came into being, but also, of course, about her experience of being shortlisted and winning the 2023 British Academy Book Prize. Professor Das is, as many of you may know, Professor of Early Modern Literature and Culture in the English faculty at the University of Oxford. So, Nandini, for those of us who may not know your work and know you particularly well, which I don't know is probably quite a small minority in this audience, but I think it'd be nice to hear. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself? Maybe some idea of the scope of your research and how and why you came to be interested in early modern literature.
Well, I suppose in some ways the scope of my research has always been interested in travel, which I myself find slightly surprising because I've got a terrible sense of direction. And perhaps that's why my interest in travel has always been thoroughly and firmly textual in that sense. But I'm particularly interested in cross-cultural encounters, what happens when individuals and cultures meet. Some of that perhaps is rooted in my own experience as an international student coming to the UK for the first time. My undergraduate friends still remind me many decades on that for the first week, all they heard from me was whenever I met or saw something interesting or different, I would say, I'd read about this somewhere. So textual knowledge for the win there, perhaps. But I've worked, as a literary scholar, I've worked on travel encounters, largely fictional in the first case. I started off working on what are called prose romances, so the precursor to the novel in some senses. And many of them follow that same template of the protagonist going on a journey. But more recently, I've particularly been interested in this idea of what happens when we actually encounter something new for the first time. And my sneaky suspicion was that new worlds are hardly ever completely new, because so much of that is framed by things we've seen and read and heard. And that's partly what I've been trying to untangle in Courting India.
Oh, it's interesting because that leads exactly from the area that you were interested in and the experiences that people bring to what they think are going to be new experiences, but they like to fit them into something more comfortable and familiar. And so I suppose the transition from the kind of work you'd been doing on travel literature, on individuals, to this extraordinary episode of travel has a logical sequence. In other words, the history that you then develop becomes part of that story.
It does. I think it's also important to recognize that when we think about those larger cultural moments, or what we think of sometimes as quite abstract points in history, they are run through and by individuals, and individual perception in those cases matters. So in some ways, quoting India is, in kind of methodological terms, you could say it's a microhistory of one particular moment. It's 4 years, very telling 4 years, at a point of crucial importance for the English in India. But it's a short period of time. What I'm particularly interested in when I was looking at the story of this embassy is how far back and forwards the resonances of that moment go. And that's particularly what I'm interested in any cross-cultural encounter, I think, that they don't emerge out of a vacuum. Neither do they usually disappear into a vacuum. In Roe's case, certainly this is the case where you can trace elements, little fragments and glimmers in his encounter with things he sees in India, not only in his in the world in which he grew up, in early modern England, in 16th and 17th century England, but back to the classics, the kind of classical literature that he might have read. So there's a long shadow there. And then, kind of projecting forward, you become increasingly aware when you're looking at this very early embassy, which tends to be rather kind of quickly glossed over because, frankly, it was in many ways a dismal failure, let's face it. But once you look at it, you realize how important it was in terms of the frameworks that it was setting up for later encounters, not only in India, but elsewhere across the globe, where the English first set foot and were trying to make their presence felt.
Yes, and the point you make about language and image, and presumably your familiarity with early Renaissance or Renaissance literature and the forms, the literary forms, would have shaped the way you approached him, because he was trying to frame it in ways that would be understood by educated contemporaries or trying to impress them in one form. Did that, do you think, shaped how he perceived what he was encountering? You get the other side in your account, which I think is so brilliant, is you get the other side of the encounter, and you realize that what he's perceiving isn't exactly what he was seeing, but he was perceiving it that way.
Absolutely. I think in so many ways, and this will not seem strange perhaps to anyone in this room, that language helps to shape our reality at multiple levels. For Roe, to some extent, language gave him a framework within which he could fit what seemed strange and alien and unfamiliar. But it also allowed him to articulate things in a way that his audiences, his readers at home, and he had multiple audiences at home, would perhaps understand this experience that no one else was going through. Apart from him, within that small coterie of people, he was in a very kind of anomalous situation as someone doing double duty to the East India Company and to his monarch.
Well, exactly. I think that's one of the things that's so extraordinary about your book and about the moment that you're describing, where you're talking effectively about three worlds. One is the Jacobean court, the other is the court of the Mughal emperors, and the other is this shadowy entity that becomes less and less shadowy as the centuries go on, which is the East India Company. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, using those, I was going to ask you about the sources then, because the sources that you get from all three of them, how would you suggest, and of course you use others as well, not just those sources, but also European and other writers, how do you think that they shaped your argument as you developed it? Do you think it shaped it or determined it, or were you finding things there that you presumed to find? Did things surprise you? Were there things that really took you by surprise?
It absolutely did, and that surprise itself has a very long history, actually. The first publication, the first thing I wrote in print about Thomas Roe was about 10 years ago. And I was asked, as academics you quite often are, to write an article about a cross-cultural encounter, and I thought Roe's account seemed interesting, so I would look at it. And in fact, I wrote about a moment which becomes the the central chapter of Courting India. It's about a bet made by Thomas Roe with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir. But when I was writing this article, I thought, okay, I'm thinking about this from an European perspective. This was about Roe making a bet that no Indian artist could imitate an English miniature that he had carried with him accurately enough. And I was thinking of it from the European perspective, particularly this 16th and 17th century idea of imitatio or imitation. And I wondered what the Mughal perception, the Persian perception at the Mughal court, of course, is deeply influenced by Persian culture in this period, what their perception would be. And I started reading about Persian ideas of something called istiqbal, which is one of the ways in which imitation works, and the way this idea of imitation is linked up with ideas of hospitality. If you think about imitation, it is very much like hosting someone, you're welcoming someone into your space. But there's also a tension there. When you're welcoming someone into your space, you're also asserting it's your space. So in that moment of that bet between Thomas Roe and the Mughal Emperor Jahangir, there were two different ideas of imitation juxtaposed against each other. And that really, I mean, I still remember looking at the accounts of Roe and thinking there's no space here for this alternative view. And that alternative view is what I wanted to really engage with within my version of the story.
Yes, so in a sense, the imitation of the visual side, because I think the visual side comes out, I mean, you use some wonderful illustrations in the text, but I think you describe it so well. So there's a sense in which the reader is transported into seeing what he sees and what the Mughals see in him. And there's a wonderful moment, I think, when you talk about the presents that he's bringing and the sort of visual lack of impressiveness of these presents compared to those sent by the Shah of Iran at more or less the same time. And there's a feeling there that the criteria for aesthetic power, if you like, is utterly different. And he's beginning to be aware of that and realizing that these things are going to be not up to scratch.
That's absolutely right. I think, Roe is sent by a state that is very much struggling financially, politically, in terms of its identity. English identity, and this is not British identity, but at this stage, that would take years, still decades, to evolve. But English identity is very fragile. It's being slowly negotiated. And Roe becomes increasingly, I think, conscious of his own marginality. And this is why, to some extent, the visual became so important for me. Because, I said that I wanted to accommodate the other perspective onto Roe's story. But here's the thing, you juxtapose Roe's journal, which is a day-to-day account of his time at the Mughal court, with the Mughal Emperor Jahangir's memoirs, the Jahangirnama, which is also a day-to-day account of the Mughal court. And then you realize suddenly, with a sinking feeling of horror, that Roe may have taken 6 pages to kind of explain and describe this wonderful moment of his engagement with the Mughal emperor. On the same day, the Mughal emperor takes 6 pages to talk about the mating habits of his pet cranes. There is no mention of the English ambassador. So in the absence of that textual acknowledgement, sometimes the visual was the way I had to go in order to excavate some of that view, which is partly why we have a very grumpy James I peering out from the corner of that Mughal miniature.
It captured rather well in that. And that's one of the things that struck you. I remember you saying that originally before, struck you about the topic, the encounter. So why was James I suddenly popping up in this miniature?
Well, this is a wonderful, wonderful miniature which is in the Freer Gallery in the US at the moment in Washington, D.C. The artist actually is the man with the red turban right in the corner, a Hindu artist called Bichitra, or the Wondrous. And the miniature itself is called, and this will tell you all you need to know about this particular painting. It's called The Emperor Jahangir Preferring a Sufi Sheikh to Kings. So there is Jahangir preferring, as we all do, to read a good book rather than pay attention to this waiting kind of bus queue of global emperors. And I suspect that the James I portrait is one of those that was copied by Jahangir's atelier, his studio of artists, from the selection of copies, perhaps not originals, we don't know, but copies of the Decryt's portrait of James when he became King of England. James VI of England, as soon as he became James VI of Scotland, became James I of England, he commissioned a whole series of portraits around his coronation, and this was one of them. It's very, very similar. So you can imagine Roe or one of his kind of fellow East India Company employees taking a copy of this portrait and it promptly finding its way into the studios.
It's a wonderful genealogy of the portrait, in the sense what it then becomes in some ways. Just before we leave the question of imitation, which struck me as really interesting, because it comes, as you said, it's a kind of notion of hospitality in the visual sense. Mm-hmm. How much did you see that in language, in terms of concepts translated or not? Or was there not that similar kind of receptivity on either side to some of the terms, the concepts, the languages brought by the other to the encounter?
That is fascinating for two reasons, actually. And this is something, as a literary scholar, I kept going back to this issue of language. Roe himself is deeply resistant to learning any of the courtly languages, Persian or Arabic, or any of the other Indian languages. He wears his English identity like armor, essentially. But there are others within his group of small-time East India Company merchants who think otherwise. So we know, for instance, if you go to the Bodleian Library in Oxford, there's this wonderful little kind of notebook by an East India Company merchant called Robert Hughes, who kind of very endearingly doodles on the side of his word list. I mean, who doesn't in the middle of a boring lesson? But he is learning Persian, so we know that there are others who are learning Persian. There's the wonderful, terribly eccentric traveler, Thomas Coriat, who's a friend of Roe's, who reunites with Roe in India, who learns Persian, and then decides that he's going to speechify at the Mughal Emperor in the hope of getting some support for the next leg of his journey, and is successful in doing that. So there's a mixed perception from the English side about linguistic exchange. Some of those give you a little snapshot of where those linguistic exchanges might have occurred. So Roe, for instance, talks about his travels, and he talks about being carried. The poor man suffers from terrible ill health from the moment he lands till the moment he leaves. So for the best part of his journey, he is carried in a carriage called, and he calls it palki, which is the Hindi and Bengali, the Indian word for it. Later on, it would get anglicized into palanquin. But at this point, you get a sense that it's unmediated in that very phonetic transcription. On the flip side, and this is where I thought, I'm waffling on here, but this is really exciting for me, so indulge me for a moment. On the flip side, we don't tend to get much of an awareness of linguistic proficiencies within the Mughal court, particularly by the emperor or others within his family, although we know that there were Jesuit tutors. for many of the Mughal princes, so there was linguistic exchange. There's a moment in Roe's diary where he talks about complaining about essentially the crown prince, Prince Khurram, who would later become Shah Jahan, to his own interpreter. And he says that the Mughal emperor overhears him and realizes that Roe, talking in his kind of half Spanish to his interpreter, is talking about mia figlio. And he immediately calls for the crown prince. Does this give us a glimpse into Jahangir's own linguistic proficiency? We're not entirely sure, but it's a lovely little opening of the window into that culture.
Well, so it's one of the techniques of the court, presumably, is you pretend you speak fewer languages than you actually do, so you can understand more things going on.
Exactly.
But it's a really interesting aspect of language exchange and misunderstanding across those different aspects. I think one of the things that you mentioned about complaining, one of the things that anyone who's read the book will, I thought one of the constant themes, which was so good, was that Roe complains endlessly about affronts to his dignity, about the weather, about the health, about the food. There's a sense in which it's like an endless 17th century moan. And
about his mother not writing to him.
Exactly. There's something very, very personal about it, and quite sort of hubristic in some ways, because you realize he's charged with this huge mission, and he's just moaning most of the time.
Yes.
But within that, comes up with some extraordinary perceptions as well.
I think this is what I found so interesting about Roe, and I think, in a way, it's really important to remember that writing about history sometimes means holding multiple things in our mind at the same time. And it would be very easy to read Roe as a one-dimensional figure who's deeply resistant to Indian culture, which he is. Roe is fundamentally responsible for setting up some of those assumptions that would regulate English behavior in colonial India for centuries after him. But at the same time, sometimes without any overt kind of acknowledgement of it, you get these glimpses of interpersonal interaction, which is equally important. And sometimes, yes, you do sympathize with this man who is alone, away from his familiar network. He's deeply hated by the East India Company merchants who, well, let's face it, simply think he's a posh boy who does not know what he's doing, who has been sent by the company to lord it over them. And at the same time, he's deeply conscious of his own sense of responsibility. And that complexity is something that I found fascinating in this figure. We could set him up as a stock laughing kind of, object of laughter. But that's not all he is. And that's particularly interesting, I think. Like all of us, this man who was in a pretty tricky situation is complicated and messy. And many of the issues that he raises tend to stay unresolved by the end of his embassy. But that's the way temporality and temporal narratives go as history develops.
No, I think that comes out extraordinarily powerfully in your writing, and as anyone here will have experienced, your communication of your ideas there has a certain, not only resonance, but an accessibility. So one of the things I was going to ask you, which is one of the challenges for many academics, is how does one write accessibly? And I think you've succeeded magnificently, because one of the things we're looking for, obviously, in the book prize is not only works of fine scholarship, but fine scholarship that can communicate itself to others. So I was getting a sense of, was this something that you were doing consciously when you were writing, that you wanted to make sure that it was something that was, without, as you said, simplifying or decomplexifying people like Roe, actually making sure that it was comprehensible, accessible in the language, in the images, in the analysis?
It was. I think when I started writing about Roe, I was deeply conscious that I wanted it to be a narrative that you could follow and you would want to follow. So there's that side of it. It was challenging in the sense that I was constantly oscillating between the English and the Indian perspective. So for me, the way to do that was to take this particular narrative format. But apart from that, I think, in a sense, Quoting India ended up, and perhaps this is not very helpful in a sense, but it ended up being the story that I wanted to tell, in the way I wanted to tell. And I should say that I'm eminently grateful to my editor, who's sitting here, for not even batting an eyelid when I very casually dropped into the conversation and that, yes, I have finished it, and oh, by the way, it has 1,200 footnotes. I was conscious that I wanted to keep that archival research and articulate the work that goes into our historical research, particularly given much of the public discourse at the moment, where there is a rising degree of skepticism, I think, about scholarship, about academic work, the work that we do as researchers, particularly within history and thinking about the past. So that was very much at the foreground of my mind. But at the same time, I wanted it to be, and as a literary scholar, again, this is a very hard habit to break, I wanted it to be something that was readable. And, I was channeling perhaps in some ways, as all good 16th and 17th century specialists do, that double duty of usefulness and pleasure. Without the latter, it's very hard to enthuse yourself to do the former.
Exactly. But I think it also goes back to something you said right at the beginning, which is about the literary forms of the Renaissance and pre-Renaissance, the notion of a journey, of an individual pursuing a journey. So it gives you a kind of framework for your story, which has an onward momentum, which I think one finds very strongly in the book, although, as you said, the momentum ends with a certain damp squib, if you like. But there's a sense in which it's a literary structure in the best possible way, but it's also, as you described it, the language you use is extremely accessible to anyone. Partly, maybe, I don't know whether you felt that the language used by Roe himself, by the others, by his contemporaries, was also, in a sense, quite direct, quite flowery, image-filled, but also quite direct in some ways.
It was, I think, and, I made a point of not modernizing many of the quotes that I have used, and I wanted to do that in order to give readers a sense of those voices, and they're terribly idiosyncratic voices. I wanted to keep that sense and heft and texture of those voices of East India Company sailors and ambassadors and inveterate gossips of the 17th century world, essentially. But I kind of also wanted to make sure that I was taking my readers with me on that journey. And you're absolutely right that the structure of Roe's experience kind of lends itself to that kind of narrativizing as well.
And I often wonder whether it also helped, something that I and I think the other judges really admired as well, was the way you resisted, I think what you call in the book at some point, a certain predetermination of focus. That is, a temptation to see in everything in the early 17th century a kind of prefiguration of the long 200 years of British or English occupation of India. And that's not there at all, which is actually very refreshing. So you're dealing with the events on their own terms without saying, oh, and this comes. Do you think that was partly, you were able to do that to some extent because you were following so many individuals with their complexity, their contradictions, that to see them as simply part of some larger panoply of history was a much, much more problematic, and actually it inured you to it to some extent?
Perhaps not in terms of seeing them as part of a larger picture, but in terms of juxtaposing them. And sometimes I had to make a very conscious, aware choice of not assuming that kind of proleptic vision, where you start off from our full knowledge of what the East India Company was going to be, what the British Empire was going to be, and assuming that this is a point of origin from which that develops. Having said that, it is a point of origin from which much of that later history does develop, but in a slightly different way, because the power relationships are so very different in this period. So it was one of those cases of being aware of the way in which this particular embassy has been read, the way it has been fitted into a teleology of empire, but also trying to kind of deconstruct that, to see that point of origin in its own right. And to do that, for me, the most useful thing was juxtaposition of different witnesses. And this is where Roe's embassy is particularly interesting, because it's very rare that you tend to have so many different, almost eyewitness accounts of the same kind of fairly, in global terms, in historical terms, the fairly small window of time. But in Roe's case, I could pretty much juxtapose, and I did have to juxtapose his account with those of the Mughals, with the Dutch, the Portuguese, the Spanish, and a fair few in between. You know, people like Thomas Coriat, who wasn't invested in any of those parties, but was very much carving his own way.
Well, I think that one of the things that becomes apparent is the variety and richness of the sources you use, and precisely be able to do that. And I suppose you had the good fortune that not only have they been preserved, for the most part, I mean, obviously not altogether, but also these were very literary cultures, in the sense that people were communicating with with headquarters, as it were, with each other. Things were written down, correspondence was extraordinarily preserved. And again, that may be through haphazard circumstances. I also wonder whether there's I don't know if anyone here remembers in the book, but I should, because the epilogue is stupendous, that Nandini wrote, which is the Earl's Court extravaganza celebrating British connection with India in about 1890, something like that. And in some ways, it's a wonderful inoculation against exactly the kinds of things that we were talking about, because there, Roe has been transformed into another character altogether,
yes,
and his whole experience has been transformed as well. It's just a wonderful read, that last epilogue, but
yes,
say something about that.
Well, I wanted to think about how Roe was received later on. And this is a wonderful moment. This is the Festival of India in Earl's Court, put up in the way that only Victorians could imagine. You know, you go for a whole day out, and you do everything from boating on a pretend Mughal kind of lake, to having your lunch and dinner, where you can go to a restaurant that is for English stomachs, or if you're a braver man, you could go for an authentic curry. So it's this wonderful thing, and of course, in the middle of it, you had to have a show. I mean, Victorians were great at these extraordinary shows, and Roe is brought into this entertainment as one of the first moments of English presence in India. And goodness, I mean, if you read Roe's journals, you'd think the poor man must have been rolling over in his grave. Because the one thing that Roe was absolutely terrified about was this idea of being an actor, or being someone that you were simply pretending to be. Essentially, this sense of being inauthentic was something that haunted him throughout his time in India. And he constantly kind of went back to references. When he was growing up in London, he was one of those, young whippersnappers, theatre-going whippersnappers of his day. So he was deeply conscious of theatrical traditions, of English theatrical traditions, where, you had Eastern empires being presented on stage, like Christopher Marlowe's Tamburlaine. So his diary is full of little glimpses of theatre. Every moment where he wants to undercut the magnificence of the Mughal court, he compares it to the theatre. And for that man to be then transformed into this Victorian theatrical set piece is just wonderful.
And he lives on the walls of the House of Parliament as an artist too.
He does, indeed. So if you happen to rush between the House of Lords and the House of Commons, St. Stephen's Hall has this whole set of murals of great moments of British history. This was post-war, it was one of those ways of building up morale in the country after the Great War. And one of those images is Roe presenting his credentials to the Emperor Jahangir.
Along the wall from the Magna Carta and the other...
Exactly, yes. There's King John, there's Walter Raleigh, and there's Armand Roe.
Well, it lives on, as it were. Well,
but here's the wonderful thing, and I loved this moment. You were asking me earlier about moments within the research. My work is on the 16th and 17th centuries. The 19th century is far too modern for me, I have to admit. When I was looking at the commissioning of the St. Stephen's Hall mural, there was a moment I realized that the man who painted it was the artist William Rothenstein, who was inspired by the time he spent in India within a group of artists called artists of the Bengal Renaissance, and Bengal is where I come from. So this is a group of artists who had gone to the newly rediscovered Ajanta and Ellora caves and imitated the paintings from there. And he uses some of that style. But here's the most wonderful little bit about Rothenstein. He is a second-generation immigrant. His father had come over to England as a merchant, as an industrialist, to revivify the English wool industry. And English wool is what Roe had been commissioned to sell in India. He had a terrible time of it, as you can imagine. 40 degrees heat in Delhi is not a place to sell English wool. But I think, again, it was that wonderful moment of aesthetic balance where Rothenstein, for me, completes that circle.
Yes, very aptly indeed. I mean, one of the things that one of the main things, of course, that the name of the book prize is to celebrate global cultural understanding. And I think that clearly it's one of the things we found so engaging about your book. And there's something interesting about Roe in that sense, and I wondered whether this is something you want to comment on, is the fact that, as you say, he retains all his prejudices, religious, racial, linguistic, about India and the Indians. But at the same time, or later on, when he's a member of parliament in 1641, I think, he's arguing for religious toleration, or a degree of religious toleration of ecumenism, which is an incredibly brave thing to do, to stand up in 1641, just on the verge of our civil war, and to argue for things that were regarded on both sides as heretical. So do you think there was an element that something did actually, whether it was simply the Indian, because he went on to be ambassador in the Ottoman court as well.
Yes.
So whether you think there's something that did percolate through in that regard, or was it purely an observation from his point of view, an interpretation of what it is that made certain societies prosper?
I think Roe would have said that it was his pragmatism. But I think certainly and particularly in this kind of moment that you mentioned, Charles, this is a moment in the very last parliament, because before parliament is dissolved, before the War of the Three Kingdoms, the civil wars in England. And this is Roe's last parliament. He's brought in as a very experienced diplomat to talk about ways in which England could recoup its financial stability on that brink of civil disturbance. And he could not be any clearer. He says the one way for our monarch, our king, to do this is to allow people from all religions and all identities to settle and do their business here, as is the practice in the kingdom of the great Mughal. who is one of the richest emperors, sovereigns of the world. So there is, I think, one of the things that intrigues me about this particular moment is that long percolation of cross-cultural influence. We tend to take a fairly short-term view of response, cultural response to moments, but sometimes these things take significantly longer to percolate through. And for Roe, that was certainly the case. Of course, no one listened to him at that point. Who listens to good advice on the brink of a financial crisis?
Well, I suppose that also leads quite aptly to a question one might ask, is that all academic books, all works of art have an afterlife. And if you were thinking about your own book and, in a sense, what kinds of message or theme would you want people to take away from it, to think about it, having read it, and to reflect, therefore, upon larger themes of global cultural understanding, or whatever it happens to be, or particular ones, what would you say would be the main themes or ideas that you'd like people to take away from this?
I think the main one for me, and this is the one that I struggled with, that I found particularly challenging, is sitting with complexity. Quite often, particularly when we think about fraught debates, historical and public, binaries are very tempting, but they're also very easy in certain senses. But repeatedly in this particular period, when I was looking through historical documents, you realize how complex a stance can be. There is no kind of on or off kind of structure within that. For a man like Roe, who is deeply, deeply critical of Indian society, on the one hand, but at the same time, deeply anxious and unsettled by it. How do you analyze? How do you engage with it? Sometimes it does mean, again, as I said earlier, it does mean keeping two things in our minds at the same time. Both of those things, contradictory as they might be, can hold true. That there is a degree of understanding, but there's also a degree of resistance, and they coexist. Because human beings are complicated and messy. We do not do clear binary thinking.
Some people would want us to do so. So the other question I was going to ask you is, who would you, if you think of a public figure or a politician, who would you prefer to have not only read your book, but actually to absorb some of those lessons?
Oh, gosh. You know what? I would much rather that my readership was much wider than single public figures and politicians. Let's face it, public figures and politicians do not fill us with high hope in the current period that we are living through.
That's true.
At this moment. But sometimes when you see collective consciousness, collective humanity and sensibility coming together, that gives us some hope. So I'd much rather that this book reached a wider readership than one single person who thinks they can change the world. That's dreadful.
Well, in a sense, your book itself is an illustration of how you cannot, as an individual, change that world. So it's an object lesson that, of course, no politician will ever accept. They may read it, but they won't accept it. So I suppose, finally, to ask you, what does it mean to you to have won the prize? Because for us, it's extraordinary to have had a chance to read your book, think your scholarship, get a sense of your thinking, and to hear you talk about it so eloquently as well. But for you to have won the prize, what kind of meaning does that have?
Well, when I was told that the book had been shortlisted for the prize, I was deeply touched and deeply excited by it, because for me personally, writing this book, writing Quoting India, crosses multiple boundaries. It crosses geographical boundaries, so this kind of trying to keep both India and England of this particular period equally weighted in our sightlines. It crosses disciplinary subject boundaries in terms of history and my own interest in culture in the fact that history is determined not simply by events, but by the cultural world, the imaginative worlds, the linguistic worlds we inhabit. So for me, it meant a lot that a book prize, which is about global cultural understanding, would embrace and accommodate this strange kind of dual vision that I was trying to achieve.
Well, I think you succeeded admirably. So I was going to ask you the last question, which is the one that any self-respecting author either dreads or embraces, which is, what is your next project?
Well, the next project is a new history of Tudor and Stuart England, which is written from the perspective of people like Roe, but people moving in and out of the country. So countless individuals who perhaps may not be as visible as Henry VIII in his Holbein portrait or Elizabeth I. Tudor and Stuart history sawns the bling in some senses, perhaps, but looking at the way England as a nation was constructed through human mobility and movement. So as one of my dear friends pointed out to me, when I said that this perhaps would be a little bit easier because I was looking at a smaller number of chapters and shorter lifespans, she looked at me and said, "You do realize that you're going to end up writing 20 full-length biographies and try to drill them down to chapters each, don't you?" I'm not looking forward to that bit, but I'm hugely looking forward to sharing that story.
Oh, well, it sounds absolutely wonderful. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Charles.
Thank you.
Thank you.